Our speaker this hour is David Kenney. David is married to the former Annette Strunk, and they have two children, James and Deborah. We value David here very much. He teaches for us denominational doctrines, how to teach against them, and he teaches for us a class that I think is very important on the preacher and media. We have him do that because he has been involved in about every form of media there is in which to communicate the gospel. He is a prolific author, writing articles for several publications. He has written a book now, and he is the editor of our lectureship book, with his good wife Annette being the formatter of our book. That is a large task in and of itself. David has done radio work. He's done podcasts. He has done television programs that are on the Gospel Broadcasting Network. And also, in addition to all that, he's pursuing a Master of Divinity degree from the School of Theology at Freed-Hardeman University, and he is the minister for the church in Newcomerstown, Ohio. We're very thankful for David and his wife, Annette. David, would you please come speak to us?
I'd like to start out by just expressing my appreciation to Andy and the lectureship committee and the Hillview Terrace leadership and all those who invited me to be able to speak. And I also wanted to, again, express my appreciation and the confidence that they bestow upon me in editing their book. That's a tremendous responsibility. It's sort of a pain in the neck, too, but it's a tremendous responsibility. But I'm very thankful to do it. I'm very thankful for Annette. If it wasn't for Annette, you'd be looking for another editor, I can tell you that. I could not do it without her. I'm thankful for David Deagle for suggesting that I speak about Egypt. And also wanted to mention Scott Judge and Ron Thomas. They print the New Testament Expositor. And if you'd like to know more about Egypt, they wanted to print some of my articles about Egypt, so you may find those interesting. The other day they had a couple issues there that had those, and you may want to subscribe to that. Also, I want to thank Seeking His World and the School of Theology for the trip that I took to Egypt back in the summer of 2024, and I'm just thankful. There's a lot of friends in the audience that I know very well, and I'm very thankful for each one of you. I'm thankful for the congregation at Newcomerstown, and just so many people that I could talk to that deserve honor and mention, but I'm just not going to be able to do that as much as I would like to do that. We're talking about going down to Egypt, and I took literally hundreds of photographs. And I thought, well, I know they want me to talk about Egypt a little bit, sort of in the title, but there's very little about Egypt that I could pinpoint and say, well, this has to do with Jacob. Matter of fact, I don't know much of anything except very broad brush pictures. So what I did was I prepared some pictures that really will just be scrolling as I'm talking through this presentation. So hopefully they'll be showing up here when Rod is able to get them going. Now, I am not an Egyptologist. I'm not an expert. I was scrambling to write everything down I could possibly write down when I was there. There's so much information and so much contradictory information that it's really a scramble to try to get everything sort of put together. Now, I guess I should say, for those of you who may like this kind of thing, I did not walk like an Egyptian. I did not hang out by the donut shop, although I did drink plenty of coffee while I was there. I did accomplish that. But archaeology has challenges and limitations. And let me just illustrate that with a story. Now, the one in the book, which I hope you get the book, because I'm not going to refer to everything in the book, but enough of it. But there's a lot of great material in the book, a lot of great lectures and effort they put forth in the manuscripts. I know I had to edit them all. So I would encourage you to pick up a copy of that book. But if you are from the other panhandle of West Virginia, over in Berkeley area, Berkeley, West Virginia, Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, you'll know that they have something there called George Washington's bathtub. And I've visited on occasion, and there's a spring there, and they put this little enclosure kind of a thing there, and they call it George Washington's bathtub. And it's sort of interesting to see, and interesting, Berkeley Springs was originally called Bath, which I found sort of curious. And tourists, if you go there, you can sit in what they call, now notice very carefully this expression, the first president's recreated tub. Did you notice the term recreated? So did he ever sit in that bathtub? Well, no, he didn't. That's something they had made since that time. But I sort of wonder how many of us have ever given thought to how would we know that George Washington had ever been there to those springs? And how would we prove that? Well, you would know that because we know that he, as a very young man, did a lot of expedition work, surveying. And he writes about that. He also owned property there in Berkeley Springs area. And he writes about that too. And there'd be deeds and documents and things like that. And you would have a good comfort level that he was there. And you could overlook the fact of the word recreated, and you could ignore that, and you could say, hey, this is George Washington was a part of this bath. And you could feel good about that, even though that event is 277 years ago. It says in the research I looked at that the first time he came to Berkeley Springs was 1748. So that's 277 years. Now, the events that we're talking about as far as Jacob in Egypt, you're talking about a span of about 4,000 years. Now let that sink in. 277 years compared to 4,000 years. That's a significant period of time. And that's important to keep in mind. Not everything survives that span of time. I mean, even in our own lives, we have moved from the 8-track to the cassette, right, to the records, to the CDs, and back to the records, and now it's digital download. I mean, look at us, just one age group of people. We have all kinds of ways of preserving things they didn't have back then. So we have to keep that in mind. But it doesn't mean we don't have any evidence. One of the major mistakes that I think some of the academics make is they overlook or don't appreciate as much as they ought to that the Bible is evidence. It's evidence. It is a source document. It's a document of antiquity. And I don't think that some of them respect it as much in that source as they ought to. Now, another interesting thing about Egypt, and I heard my guide say this, and the guide was from Egypt, so I mean, he would definitely know, right? I mean, but I found it so preposterous, I couldn't believe it. And a statement he made was that not even 5% of Egypt has ever been excavated. And I thought, well, that can't be right. That can't be right. So I looked and I found that this lady's name is Sarah Parkak, and she is an archaeologist and Egyptologist, and she specializes in space satellite archaeology. Now let that sink in. Space satellite archaeology. You might think, what in the world are they talking about? But if you think about it, you know as well as I do that a lot of the monuments and everything in Egypt, they're laid out geometrically. And you can spot geometrical patterns of things that have not been excavated from satellite imagery. That's what she's using. But in her statement that she wrote about, and I think it was a part of a TED Talk as well, she made this statement. She said less than 1% of ancient Egypt has been excavated. So that is really something to keep in mind. What will be discovered as excavation continues to go? And that's really important to keep in mind. I mean, we need to recognize and be mindful of the fact that we have good reason and reasons to trust the Old Testament. There's no reason to doubt it. But you will have people, they'll come along and they'll try to tell you that you can't trust the Old Testament based on what they're seeing. Oh, wait a minute. If that statistic is even remotely close to the bigger picture, less than 1%, that means 99% they don't know. But they could be really assertive about that you can't trust the Bible. Well, I think I'll stick with the 99% and stick with the Bible. Thank you very much. And I don't have time to spend a lot on this and as far as archaeology, but you need to be careful about outlandish claims and those that make them. Things like, chariots in the bottom of lakes and stuff like that. You got to be careful of those kinds of things. There's people that will try to tell you all kinds of things that you need to be wary of. But on the other part of the warning I want to emphasize, you need to be very careful about not overselling what you found or what you're reading about. Sometimes people will tell you things and state them as being so clear that when you get there, you're like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? I don't see anything as much as you have asserted it. Now, that is very important. Archaeology is a new science, but I want you to think about when we teach apologetics, one of the disciplines that we look at is archaeology. And we encourage people to know that you can know there's a God, you can know Jesus is His Son, you can know the Bible's His Word. That's absolutely true. But we need to be careful that we do not oversell it, that we tell things as if they're so certain that there can be no doubt about it. And to me, when I'm thinking about that statement, I'm thinking specifically about archaeology, because it may not be as certain as you might think that it is. If you went to Egypt, you might be surprised. Well, if you have all this preconceived idea that everything's going to be so certain that you go by and you're not going to see signs that said Moses slept here, or Moses went to school here, or Jacob stayed here, or Joseph reigned, you're not going to see any of that. Again, 4,000 years ago. Well, that's pretty troubling. But not really. You're talking about something 4,000 years ago. And that is something that you want to keep in mind. Now, Bible chronology is an interesting part of the challenge. I like Bible chronology. I find it very fascinating, but very frustrating, because I like solid data points. And I like to know, and I like to arrange things in chronological order. I like to know what time period they're in, when they happen. I like to know how these events relate to other world events and all that. And, you can get you a nice little chart, but you start looking at the data points and start looking at the evidence for them. Some of them, you're going to go, I really wish I could pinpoint this down more accurately. And if you doubt that, just pick up one book of Bible chronology and then look at another one, and you'll find out that they don't all agree. They just don't all agree. Wayne Jackson made this statement about the importance of biblical chronology. He said, some Bible events are ambiguous in terms of date. Others are more precise. The chronology of the Scripture is sufficient, however, for its intended purpose. So again, we want to be careful about matters relating to archaeology and matters relating to biblical chronology. The date of the Exodus is subject to debate. Even the length of time the Israelites spent in Egypt is subject to debate among Bible scholars, even to this day. Now, I want to provide you with three basic views of the Exodus. Now, in my trip to Egypt, I was in a class called Biblical Archaeology. And part of that class is I had to write a term paper. And I thought, well, I'll do this one little piece of Bible chronology, archaeology piece. But the teacher, he wouldn't let me off with that. He said, well, if you want to know that piece, then you have to know the date of the Exodus. You have to know this date, this date, this date, because all of them are linchpinned together. And I was like, but I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to write about all that. I want to write about this little thing. He wouldn't let me do it. It's all connected. And some of those things are difficult to sort out. So in the lectureship book, I gave you three different sources on three different views about the date of the Exodus. And I'll tell you what they are. There are those who argue the Exodus occurred in about 1446. the length of the time within Egypt was about 430 years. That would make Jacob's going down to Egypt about 1876. That's one view. Another view, there are those who argue that while the Exodus occurred in 1446, the 430-year period can be divided up between the time that they spent in Egypt and the time that they spent in Canaan, which would make the time in Egypt about 215 years. Well, I never heard of that before. Never heard of it before. And my teacher explained to me that that is basically the view that's advocated in the Septuagint. And I found that sort of interesting. And when I was taking Hebrew, I asked my teacher about that. I said, is it possible that the Septuagint's presentation of chronology could be harmonized with the Masoretic text? And the response basically was, there is nothing in the Masoretic text that would eliminate that view. But it doesn't advocate it either. So it's a possibility. And then the third is that some people argue that the Exodus was in 1266, and the period of Egypt would be 430 years, would make the period of Jacob's relocation 1696. Now, I don't support that view. I don't think Ramses II was the pharaoh. I could tell you which view I support, but it'd be just my opinion. So I gave you 3 sources in the lectureship book that you can look up and read. And you can do the research, and hopefully you have better luck than I do. But the purpose of this lecture is not really to discuss time schemes. Remember, biblical archaeology, it's always subject to revision. The turn of the shovel can change the whole landscape of things. And so you want to remember that when you're talking about these things. But there's no reason to doubt the accuracy of the text under consideration. But there are some difficulties, challenges, when we start thinking about it. But I hope by the time that this lecture is concluded that you have a firm understanding that archaeology is limited and chronology is complicated. But regardless of those 2 things, God's Word is truth. God's Word is true. All these other things are just things that we're trying to figure out with extraneous stuff. God's Word is true. And we need to remember that. Now, Jacob, brother of Esau, the son of Isaac and Rebekah, when you talk about people in the Bible, and this has been mentioned several times, and we know it to be the case, they were imperfect. They were imperfect. It's interesting that the Bible even records some of the greatest figures in the Bible, their imperfections. That goes to bias. The Bible is not a biased book. It tells you their imperfections. But be careful when you read about their imperfections that you don't allow those to become an excuse for your imperfections. That would be the wrong idea. The right idea, I believe, would be that despite your imperfections and my imperfections, God is able to use us for His glory. That would be a better lesson to remember. Those people in the Bible were imperfect. We're imperfect too. We're all dependent upon God's grace and God's mercy. Jacob's name literally means one who takes the heel. And based on the narrative, which we've talked about, between Esau and Jacob, the term became to be a supplanter and a deceiver. And Jacob really drove that message home, didn't he? He was given the name Israel, which means Prince of God, that Peniel, which means the face of God. This is Genesis 32:30. And Mike Vestal talked about that excellently on Tuesday evening. So Jacob's name Israel would become the name of God's nation, His peculiar people. He had already gone through a lot of hardships, but there would be many more to come. It's one of the textbook case examples of why it is so dangerous to play favoritism among children in the home. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And that's something that you can see the ruination of Jacob's family, whether you're talking about his parents or whether you're talking about him with his children. It's a big lesson that we cannot let slip, that we need to be mindful about. So for the sake of time, I would consult prior lectures on the life of Jacob, the tragedies of Joseph, and the treachery of Jacob's other sons. It's heart-wrenching. I mean, John Keith did a great job on talking about that. I don't know about you, I have a hard time reading about Joseph without wanting to cry. The things that he went through, just, if you put yourself in his position just a little bit, it's just awful what he went through. But let's take a look at Genesis 46, 1 through 27, Jacob's journey to Egypt. Joseph has now revealed his identity to his brothers, who were fearfully dismayed at his presence. Yeah, you better believe they were. They should have been. They should have been scared for their lives. Boy, Joseph was a lot better man than his brothers were. But Joseph reassures them and instructs them to bring their families to Egypt immediately, as the famine already lasted 2 years, so there's an additional 5 years to go. Long time. He wants them to be near to him so he can provide for them. They were dwelling in Beersheba at the time, which is the southern portion of Canaan. God reassures Jacob to go down there and promised that Israel would come out a great nation. Now, famines were common in biblical times. Now, this is one of the things that I didn't fully appreciate as much when I was down there looking around. I didn't realize it. I'm like, well, surely a 7-year famine, that had to be a data point here somewhere. But it's not. They are so common. Matter of fact, there was during the reign of Djoser, that's D-J-O-S-E-R, he reigned around 2690 to 2670. There was a famine in his land 7 years in duration. That's not the one we're talking about. So much so that they erected a monument to it and talked about it. It's called the famine stela. And so those kinds of things, they weren't exactly rare. In our day and age, we have it made, don't we? We have it made so easy. I mean, can you imagine that we were all in a panic over toilet paper, for crying out loud? We have it so easy. Of course, Joseph was given divine insight to prepare for this famine before it struck. That's Genesis 41. Pharaoh is glad to hear of this reunion, authorizes Joseph to make whatever provisions necessary to bring his family to Egypt for their protection. At first, Jacob doesn't believe them, but as he sees the provisions that Joseph provided, his spirit revives. He decides to go to Egypt to see his beloved son before he dies. There's an interesting statement. It's very touching. This is 46, verse 4. The Lord stated, Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. You know what that means? According to one commentator, it means you're going to die there. But you'll see your son, the son that you've missed all these years, and he'll be the one to close your eyes for the final time after you've died. Now that might sound a little morbid to you, unless you've had to do it yourself for your parent. I have. So that happens. He goes down there. He goes to see them. And in the book, I give you a breakdown of all the family that go down there by their mother and different things about it, back and forth. And I don't have time to go through all that. I don't want to go through all of it because it gave me a headache when I was researching it in the first place. All those numbers and people and all that. I mean, that's a lot to try to keep straight. But one writer pointed out that there were more people that went than just the immediate family, so to speak. One writer estimated there could have been as many as 200 to 300 additional people that went. So this is a major relocation for them. So he settles in Egypt, chapter 46, 28 through 34. They settle in the land of Goshen. That's the northern part of Egypt, an area referred to as the Nile Delta. Now, this area is called Lower Egypt. Now, this is sort of strange. You don't have to remember this. They call the northern part Lower Egypt and the southern part Upper Egypt. And that's sort of strange to sort of contemplate, but it's talking about elevation, not talking about the compass. So you may want to remember that. Goshen was a territory of over 900 miles. The land is very fertile, and it still is today. I can remember standing, you'll see the pictures of me at the pyramids, and you can stand there and you can just turn a little bit. There's sand all around you, but just like over here in the distance, there's green all over the place. It's just hard to imagine. But that's the way that it is. It's extremely fertile. Matter of fact, the number one industry of Egypt today is still agriculture. And that's pretty fascinating to think about. Egypt has often been called the breadbasket of Rome. It fed the Roman Empire. So this is one of the reasons why Egypt figures so predominantly in the wars of the Roman Empire. They had the food. They had it. And it was a major factor in their relationships. There are several sites in Goshen of interest, and I put them in the book for you, but we were able to go to Tanis, which is believed to be Zoan, which is mentioned in several places in the Bible. It was made famous by the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's the one they were talking about. We were there. Got to see it. Tanis has also been called the Thebes of the North because it looks a lot like Thebes, which is called Luxor today. They say that the greatest discoveries that were made in Egypt were not King Tut, but they were found in Tanis. You may say, how come we never heard about them so much? Well, that's because there were other events capturing the news at the time, World War II. But they say that Tanis revealed some of the greatest discoveries that archaeologists have ever made, which is sort of interesting to think about. Now, Tanis is about 3.5 hours northeast of Cairo. And when you're there and you see all the broken monuments, now they brought monuments and things from other places, the Egyptians did, and built this city. And so I could imagine it'd be very difficult to figure out, okay, what was built here and what was imported. But imagine it's all covered with sand and debris for all this time, and you have to dig through it, and you have no map. I'm walking across all these mounds, and they're just stacks of dirt. And I'm like, how could anybody make any sense of any of this? So I was really impressed by what they were able to do, and not surprised by what they are unable to do. Now, the reunion between Joseph and Jacob could only perhaps be surpassed by the hope of reunion we have with Christ and our loved ones who've gone on before. Remember, Jacob believed Joseph was dead. It is estimated that Jacob thought Joseph was dead 22 years. This had gone on. I can't imagine that. But now his heart is fully satisfied. He's prepared to face death, Jacob is, because he's seen the son he thought was dead but was alive. You know, when you think about that, to me, it just makes heaven that much more precious, doesn't it? You know, we're in the land of the dying. I'm anxious to see the land of the living. Now, Joseph encourages the heads of the families to report their occupation as shepherds. Now, why is that? Well, I'll tell you what, everybody has an opinion about that. It could have been that the Egyptians just didn't like them, but they didn't have a problem with cattle. It could be that there's a natural disdain between cattlemen and sheep. I don't know if any of you ever watched Rawhide, the old Western. There's an episode, The Black Sheep, that's all about this antagonism between cattlemen and sheep shepherds. It might be that they just didn't get along. We don't know. It could be that they had an aversion to sacrificing sheep because, remember, the Egyptians are idolaters, and they sacrifice sheep. That could have been offensive to them. We don't know that. They may have viewed shepherds as some type of gypsies or something of that nature. Don't know. We're not exactly told why there is such a prejudice, but it was strong enough that all they had to do really was to say we're shepherds, and Joseph knew they will keep us all together. And that's what Joseph wanted. They'll keep us all together. And notice that even though the prejudice against shepherdmen are not revealed, it tells them that Pharaoh gave them the greatest of the land, which is fascinating to think about. God provided for them. As we go and we look at Joseph as vizier in Egypt, that's 47, 1 through 12, he reveals to Pharaoh that his family has settled in Goshen, and he asks their occupation. They do all that, and they talk about their pilgrimage, and he asks, how old are you, Jacob? And he says, well, I'm not as old as, the prior guys, but, to give you some ideas, Isaac was 180 years old, Jacob 175. Jacob lived to be about 147. Now, the famine had impacted both Egypt and Canaan, and Joseph managed the finances of the house of Pharaoh. His position was called a vizier, and that was second only to Pharaoh himself. Now, while I was in Egypt, I visited the mortuary temple of a person that also had that same title named Rekmar, Vizier Rekmar. And you go in there, and they have artwork all over the place. He served in that position for at least 2 pharaohs. Incidentally, they think these pharaohs are connected to the days of Moses and the Exodus. And that could be. But you can see all the fascinating artwork they had there, like the brick-making procedure, just like you'd read about it in Exodus. There's a little fascinating picture there of a guy sitting, and he's writing on a tablet. But I was told, I remember reading that you couldn't write anything back then. Nobody knew how to write back then. But here's a guy in artwork. He's writing. I found that fascinating. I told that to my professor, and he told me, he said, David, he said, if you said that to somebody today, they would laugh you out of the field of archaeology. But I can remember skeptics saying that Moses could not have written the Pentateuch because he didn't know how to write. There was no writing then. Well, they found that not to be the case. But because of the providence of God through the life of Joseph, the family of Jacob survived in Egypt, but the famine would get worse. Chapter 47, 13 through 26. It's now been 3 years with 4 more years to go, and it gets worse, and the Egyptians are having a terrible time. They're trading everything away for life. But the Israelites are prospering. Joseph offers the Egyptian seed to plant, provided they agree to pledge 20% to Pharaoh. And they did that for everybody except the priest, the Egyptian priest. You might think, well, that's pretty oppressive, but notice what they say in verse 25 of chapter 27. You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. And they would be. You go on, 47 through 27 through 31, the prosperity of Israel and Joseph's vow to Jacob. While the Egyptians were selling all that they had to survive, Israelites were doing pretty well. But the time of Jacob's death was still approaching. That's something that you need to remember. Life may be going great, but your day of dying is coming. Life may be going really horrific. Your day of passing on is coming. But don't allow the events of the world crowd out your personal life and your position and your relationship with God. Jacob's death is approaching. Joseph meets with Jacob, who makes him swear not to bury him in Egypt, but with his fathers, Isaac and Abraham. So he makes Joseph put his hand under his thigh. That was a manner of making a binding oath. And it says that Jacob bows either at the head of his bed or on the top of his staff, depending if you're looking at the Septuagint or the Masoretic text. Clyde Woods, one of my professors at school, he pointed out that the terms are so similar in the spelling that it could be one or the other, but they mean basically the same thing. He made him swear, don't bury me here. Well, Joseph would bring his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to be blessed by Jacob before his death. You could read about that. Joseph would honor his oath to his father, place his body in a cave of Machpelah with the bodies of Isaac, Rebekah, Abraham, and Sarah, and Leah. That's Genesis 49:31 and chapter 50, verses 12 through 14. If you recall, Rachel died and was buried near Bethlehem, Genesis 48, verse 7. And Joseph would make a similar request. He would make a request to have his bones taken up to Canaan when the Israelites were to return to their homeland. And I find that very significant that he would do that. When you look around, especially when I was thinking about that mortuary temple to Vizier Reckmeyer, it's a big complex. And I wonder, what would they have built, the Egyptians had built for Joseph? A big pyramid for him? A big structure for him? Big monuments for him? There's none of that. He doesn't seem to be interested in that, does he? No, he wants his bones to be taken to Canaan. And they fulfilled it. They did what he had instructed them to do. But I find it interesting, you don't read about that until Joshua 24:32. But they honored his request. If I understand the text properly, I believe they took him home, to his home, the home that his brothers had taken him from. He never got over that. That's always his home. That's where they buried him. Shechem for Joseph is his birthplace, his childhood home. Now, when we think about some things that I'd want to add in conclusion, the story of Joseph and the life of Jacob was filled with temptations, trials, adversities, misadventures, conspiracy, sins, and I could list more. Their lives were filled with that. They had to deal with it, or experience it, or inflict it. We will experience some of these same things. Some adversities may even come from our physical families. I mean, Jesus said that, right? Jesus told us that. It might even come from members of our spiritual family. That might happen to us. We might experience some of these things. It might be that when our burdens increase, the people that are supposed to help us bear our burdens fail. They may fail us. But we need to have the faith that Joseph had. I mean, the man is practically alone if it wasn't for God. When times like these happen to us, hopefully we can say something like what Joseph said. And here's what he said, Genesis 50, verse 20. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about, as it is this day, to save many people alive. Our God is faithful, and we need to be too. Thank you very much.